Hi, Joel Moore here. I wanted to give a recap of the Rogue 2022 season, kind of see where we're sitting on the leaderboard going into final judging here. Nothing's really moved over the last month. I reached out to Rogue this last week. There's a lot of interest from other competitors on where the overall contest was sitting, so I reached out to them and asked them, like, hey, where's judging going to end up on this? Last year in 2021, all of the judging had completed as of December 23rd, but there was significantly less competitors since that was the first year they had ran the full program. And then coming into this year, there's obviously a lot more competition starting to kind of build up on the overall contest. Um, so we'll kind of recap what all happened over the last year, give a base of like where I started from in 2021, what I did differently in 2022, and then kind of my focus for 2023. And we'll go over also the start of this year's contest and the effects that I've kind of been dealing with over the last day from that challenge as well. So that's what we'll kind of dive into here. So give this. Just jump back here for a second. So overall leaderboard in 2021, we had pretty interesting year overall, where we had, I didn't realize until midway through the year that there was an overall contest. So just a lack of knowledge on the actual events kind of caused me a little bit of challenge there. So I had originally done the bear hug back in February or March of 2021. I had picked that contest. I'd seen the 50 cal contest, but I didn't have access to an Echo bike at the time and hadn't really taken the efforts to really go into finding a place that has one. So I hadn't done that contest. The bear hug I figured was something that was up my alleyway. I do a lot of big game hunting in the fall and wintertime, and so endurance with a large load and the ability to take what I figured was going to be mostly just a pain-filled event would work in my favor. But starting from early to mid 2020, I had been doing too much office work, and my hips had really gotten pretty messed up from just an excessive amount of inactivity and then extreme activity on the back side of that. So I was dealing with a lot of hip issues at the time of that contest. So then I picked up again from the suitcase contest in 2021 onwards. I'll kind of scroll over here. And from the suitcase forward, I was nonstop on it. We can see a very low score here on the Bandit challenge, and that was for kind of two reasons. And the top one was that I had set up a camera angle on the chin-ups for that contest. There's three parts to that contest. The first part was a 1 mile run. The second part was a max effort front squat. And then the third part was max repetition strict chin-ups. And so on my strict chin-ups, and I was dealing with some illness at the time, so I was competing fairly late at night after having rested after work that day. And I hadn't really read all of the rules that year, and I missed one key aspect, and that was it said that you could not compete on the chin-ups with no footwear. So you had to have shoes on, which is a relatively small deal, but that essentially disqualified me. What I think it was mostly, though, that they picked on that rule to disqualify it, but the reality of it was that my camera angle was too low relative to where my pull-up bar was. And so what that caused was when I was doing the actual chin-up, you couldn't define clearly whether my chin had cleared the bar outside of like the trajectory angle that I had filmed at. So the difficulty of judging it was probably too great. So that was my fault on it, and I've since really dug into making sure that I'm very strict to the rules and that my videography is actually accurate. That's probably one of the bigger challenges of the overall Rogue events, is just the videography aspect of it, especially since you have to typically, you're filming yourself solo in my instance, and so you have to be very cognizant of capturing all of the rules in there. But that said, we ended up with a second place win, and what that gave me the ability to do was I hired on a coach going into the 2022 season in Ian Daniels. Very excellent, top level powerlifter, Olympic lifter, and prior CrossFit athlete, and with extensive knowledge in rehab as well, around back and hip issues and shoulder issues and any other injuries that professional athletes, especially in strength sports, tend to encounter, as well as having background in some endurance events such as mountain climbing and other things of that nature. So that's what I kind of did coming in off of that second place win in Rogue in 2021. And then I also had a couple of my old gym buddies who very clearly explained to me that being in second place was the same as being in last place. So we've kind of fueled off of the general sentiment there and helped to drive our 2022 performance. The main thing with these road contests is you essentially have to try and accomplish a general level of extreme fitness and power throughout, and endurance capability throughout the year. You don't really know what the event's going to be, so you can't have specificity of training. Now, what's very fascinating though here is we see a very broad range of scores between the top levels in 2022 for the men, where we had a very wide range. Some of it was just a lack of competitiveness on the overall contest, but also what you had was specificity of contestants. So on the women's front, pretty much the only thing you had was CrossFit athletes. I mean, your top 10 women were either straight up just CrossFit, or in the case of Shayna Wirahana, that she's a strongman competitor, strong woman competitor. So there you have a very narrow selection of competitors that were competing in all of the events, and you didn't have specialists really showing up to some of these. And the lack of specialists kind of caused most of the women's scores to sit in the same general region there. And we'll go into that later in terms of how that outcome kind of played out there. On the men's front, though, you have, because of the monetary prize money for each individual contest, you have specialists who they are really, really, really good at one of these modalities of strength, and that's what their entire training is revolved around. And so they'll come in and they'll just absolutely dominate it. And so your part in an overall contestant is to place as high as you possibly can by maintaining strength in all of these different disciplines and being able to apply it effectively. So that's where 2022 really has come out quite well. We have seen, though, that so far judging on the overall has not completed for the men. We don't see any change here from, I had done some tracking actually, because there wasn't really an update from Rogue a lot of times on their overall contest. So I would track it in a spreadsheet manually at the end of each one. So at the end of the last contest on the wheel challenge, I uploaded all of the scores after the judging of wheel contest had completed. And we see here where we kind of sit before judging on the prior contests had occurred. Now, we have a fairly good buffer between myself and Giovanni, but we do have this issue from the slingshot challenge still, where Giovanni is rated at an 81 score. We'll kind of go into that here because I find this to be an area that might be of interest to people. So one of the rules in here for the slingshot challenge was, if at any time the kettlebell rests on the floor, the set will be terminated. So the slingshot challenge was a shift, and this is where Rogue has really been doing some great work in terms of incorporating different strength modalities, meaning that you want to look at whether a contestant can compete well in Olympic lifting, powerlifting, kettlebell lifting, old man strongman feats of strength, new strongman feats of strength, anything that's essentially a strength or endurance event. How fast is your mile? How fast is your longer distance events? And that kind of defines like whether or not you're that all-around athlete that can really handle some of these harder, events. And it's outside of like CrossFit, which tends to focus on timed events and things of that nature versus like max effort, contests. So that's where Rogue's really set itself apart. It's a completely different type of lifting contest. So here we have long form kettlebell lifting, which I had never been familiar with before, but you're essentially accomplishing a 10-minute continuous kettlebell snatch at a very heavy weight for men at 24 kilo or 53 pounds. And you're only allowed to shift between your hands one time during that 10-minute interval. And when that shift occurs, you can only have one backswing of the kettlebell before it has to go overhead again with the new hand. So if the kettlebell rests on the floor, then the set will be terminated at that point. So essentially, when you switch hands, if you switch hands, you set that kettlebell on the ground, boom, you're done. Like, your one hand was the only thing that you get there. So we see here with Giovanni, and we'll watch his transition here. He's completed 52 reps up to this point with his right hand, I believe. And we'll see it coming through. And he sets it down and switches and begins back overhead again. So kind of the same issue that had occurred for me in the prior year where I had, that issue around not having shoes on during the chin-up. We should see before the leaderboard on the men's side completes that this slingshot challenge will get reassessed. But here's where it gets interesting. So if a score such as right here with Matt Olson, where on the pump and row he scored a 2, essentially on a weighted average basis for the weighted scoring between the 3 different weight classes, they have to score all of the contestants down to that point in order to determine whether his 2 is an accurate score, or if he should have scored 10 or 15 points potentially if you disqualify other competitors that were above him in the leaderboard. So this is what takes Rogue a very long time in this setup, is because you have to judge all of the contestants down to the lowest competitor that's in the overall competition for that contest. So very tricky. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Hopefully, all of my scores were accurately completed. And we have some buffer room, and we have additional buffer room depending on where Giovanni and Matt Olson kind of end up on this overall scoreboard here, especially with kind of the slingshot issue that we found there. So that's very interesting. Now, here is where things got quite fascinating this year on the women's side. So we'll go back to before overall judging had really kicked off on the women's side. We see that Marissa Weiss was first place with a total of 710 points before final scoring had begun. And this is very fascinating because I couldn't find any of her scores. And this tends to be a thing with a lot of the CrossFit athletes. They list their YouTube videos only unlisted. And then if Rogue disqualifies them on the Beyond the Whiteboard app, it's very hard to track down the unlisted video again. So that's what happened here. So we see a shift on the women's side from, for Melissa specifically, from first place all the way down to 6th place from a disqualification on the 50 cal, which hearsay is due to not having the wind guard, from having the wind guard on the 50 cal bike during it. So that was one of the requisites of that challenge, is that you have to have an unmodified, no wind guard, Rogue Echo bike to perform that contest. So she was disqualified on the 50 cal, which goes to a 0 score, and then disqualified on the cliffhanger. Now here's where it's very interesting. And this is something that I've posed to a lot of athletes. And some of them, they only post their highest score. But if you post 2 or 3 videos of your top scores, and let's say your best score got disqualified, you then have a chance to come back and say, hey, I posted another one, and I didn't miss this step in the rules on this other video. Please take this one into consideration because it is within the rules of the contest, that you've submitted multiple attempts. So if you're able to perform multiple attempts, it can assuming you didn't make the exact same mistake in each video, it could help you in the long run. So that's a very good like strategy thing to keep in mind with these contests. If she had performed one with a wind guard on one bike and then on another bike without the wind guard that complied with the rules, might be able to contest something like that and get some or all of the points back, depending on the results of that attempt. So that's where when you see a 0, you've been completely disqualified, and it's your only video that you've essentially pushed out to the rules. So that was what the shakeup happened there. So we see a pretty and on my spreadsheet I didn't capture the last women's event either. So that was kind of prior to the final LSIT contest and wheel contest. I captured through the LSIT, but not through the wheel here for women. So that was a big shakeup that we saw in the last few days, where the first place woman, now 6th place after 2 disqualifications. But we're still waiting to see how it's going to turn out for the men. So that's kind of where we landed on 2022. From my perspective on my overall performance for the events, I really struggled on the Turkish get-up and the slingshot contest, 2 modalities that like I just have not been exposed to prior to this, and those I'm working to bring up, with a lot of the coaching that Ian's doing with me. So those should be stronger in the next year. We'll see how it goes. Definitely very unique contests, not something you typically train on a max Turkish get-up. So, and then you also don't know if the contests are coming back. So that's where my training for this next year is going to focus more on my goals, still around a 600-pound deadlift or triple body weight, and getting my mile time below 6 minutes. And then we're also going to be really driving into Olympic weightlifting and working to get essentially a super total able to be posted between powerlifting and Olympic lifting. If you do both, then you can post what's called a super total in weightlifting, which is the combination of the 2 disciplines. So that's kind of my focus for this next year, and we'll see how that plays out. So now we'll go into the very brutal opening of the 2023 season, which was the Echo Hammer Challenge. And this was definitely not one of my stronger events, but according to the scores, they say it is a strong event. But I will say I'm still quite in a lot of pain with my lungs. Definitely not something I have trained extensively on the Echo bike. Go over to XS CrossFit near me and usually do the contest there, since they have an actual Echo bike that I'm able to train on. So as of Sunday afternoon here, we're sitting at 135 calories. We had a peak wattage of 1331 watts, while Jarrod Mills here had a peak wattage that was substantially lower than that. He kind of aimed for a different strategy. He went for the steady state, made continuous RPM, which definitely is a little easier on the lungs, I think, just trying to maintain that. I went ahead and hit the 20 to 30 second sprint off the bat, and then fell into just a nice steady cadence to the best of my abilities. And that got us out, had a pretty decent score overall. So we're looking strong going into 2023 here. The big thing is our hips are in substantially better shape than they were coming into the start of last year. So we're actually able to transition from just maintenance mode of trying to recover from injuries to actually progressing our strength, our endurance, and our overall work capacity this year. And that's going to be kind of the focus. We're also have incorporated in daily ice baths, doing them right off the bat in the morning. And we're going to be doing some tests on our blood work here. See what is the effect on testosterone, what's the effect on our breathing and lung capabilities over the year, and just generally seeing how it affects the changes there. So I'll go into more depth on that in another video. But if you guys enjoyed this, give it a like, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and we'll keep cracking on this year. Very excited for what is going to be coming up on the contest and on our overall training. So take care.